You're a what? I said, a race director. They said, what the heck's a race director? Like, what do you do? Chalk mark in the road, yell go, up they go. I said, well, that's part of the equation, yeah, but you want to really know what I do? They said, yeah. What I do is I help raise the level of self-esteem and self-confidence of tens of thousands of people around this world.
Are you running a marathon? Oh my God, I could never run a marathon. You sure about that? My God, a marathon is like 42 kilometers, 26 miles. I don't understand those people. That used to be me.
But not anymore. Welcome to the Marathon Podcast. My name is Christian Warwick, aka Warwick Runs on different platforms. Really happy to have you here. And today I want to ask you a favor. I have a lot of people listening to this podcast, but not so many reviews or followers on the pod. So I would really appreciate you guys following the pod wherever you listen and give it a review. Share it with a friend, tag the Marathon Podcast when you are listening. We'd really appreciate that. In today's episode, we have Dave McGillivray on. He's the race director of the Boston Marathon. He's quite a legend within the running community. He has given so much to this community that we are a part of. He ran across the US when he was 23. He's talking a little bit about this. He's done several Ironmans. He's done more than 170 marathons. He did Chicago Marathon on Sunday. He's done 7 marathons in 7 continents. He did run Boston Marathon blindfolded at some point. He has directed or hosted events all over the world, more than 1,400 of them. Dave is just such a good guy, and I had such a good time talking to him. We only had 45 to 60 minutes of talking, so the episode is a bit shorter than usual. And we did have some technical problems in the middle of it. Hopefully, we were able to save all of the audio so it still sounds good to you guys. But if not, hope you bear with us. It was not our fault. It's technical issues, and that happens sometimes. I'm in Norway. Dave is in Massachusetts. Obviously, we're going to face some issues every now and then. I do think that we will, or you're able to listen to this and enjoy it still. And I'm just going to let you listen to this conversation with Dave. Dave, welcome to the Marathon Podcast. It's an honor to have you here.
Well, it's an honor to be on, too. Feelings mutual.
It's funny because when I did my first Boston Marathon this spring, it was amazing. And then as a part of the preparations, I was watching that Boston Marathon documentary where you were an important part of that documentary. And before we start talking about everything Boston and, all of the things that you've accomplished, I'm interested to hear about your run across the U.S. At 23 years old, you did. What was your inspiration to do that?
Well, for me, growing up in Boston, I'm surrounded by sports, right? Professional sports, Red Sox baseball and hockey and Patriots, Bruins, Celtics. And so as a little kid, that's all I saw and what I was focused on. And I wanted to be a professional athlete. But for me, short in stature, I was always the last one picked when my friends picked sides and the last one cut when I went out for the team. So I was, it was a rough go as a little boy trying to, sort of prove myself as an athlete when I wasn't being given a chance. And so I started running because no one can cut you from running. And then I just started challenging myself to personal running goals. And when I turned 12, I ran 12 miles on my 12th birthday, and 13, 14. And I've been doing this crazy thing for 60 years now. I'm 71. So I've been running my age on my birthday for the last 60 years. And then, when I turned 17, I heard about this thing called the Boston Marathon. So I called up my grandfather and I said, hey, I'm going to go run that race in Boston. He's like, oh, well, they call that the Boston Marathon. I said, well, that's a good name for it. I'm going to go run it. So he said, I'll meet you at the 24-mile mark. He said, okay, so my brother drove me to the start. I take off. I'm running, and bam, down I go. In the hills in Newton, around 20 miles. Got taken to the local hospital in an ambulance. Called my parents, and they came pick me up, drove me home. I called my grandfather, no answer. Call him again, no answer. 9 o'clock at night, he answers the phone. I said, Grandpa, where have you been? He goes, Dave, where have you been? I've been waiting for you all night. Old Kelly goes by, the street sweepers go by. There's no Dave. And I said, yeah, I know, I quit. He said, what? I said, I failed. Nah, you didn't fail. I said, I didn't. What I do? He said, you learn. I said, great. What I learned? You learn you cannot go along in life and set reckless goals. You had no business being in that race. I said, you're right. He said, I'll cut another deal with you. So what's that? Until you train for it next year, I'll be here waiting. I said, deal. Well, about 2 months later, he died. And I said, I got to do this for Grandpa. And I trained, turned 18, officially registered, was doing 120, 130 miles a week, was ready to go. And the day before I get sick, my parents said, you can't run. I said, I have to run. The newspapers are saying Dave running in memory of Grandfather. And I said, can you give me something that very few other people have ever given me before? What's that? A chance. Isn't that all we ever want in life, is a chance to accomplish something? Okay, they drive me to the start. I take off. I'm running awful. I get to the point where I dropped out the year before. I'm doing the survivor shuffle over the hills. Finally, at 21 and a half, boom, down I go again. Dropped out of my second Boston Marathon. And I'm sitting on the curb, my head in my hands, thinking, what a loser. This wasn't meant to be. And all of a sudden, a defining moment happened in my life. And I turned around, and I couldn't believe where I was sitting. I was sitting right in front of the Evergreen Cemetery. And that's where they buried my grandfather. And there's his tombstone, like literally right behind me. And he said he'd be there waiting for me on the Boston Marathon course. I picked myself up, and I said, he kept his end of the deal. I'm going to keep my end of the deal. And I finished in 4.5 hours. And I said on that day, April 1973, I was going to run this race every year for the rest of my life. And on a tribute to the lesson my grandfather taught me about earning the right to do these things. And I've run it for the last 53 years in a row. And then when I graduated from college, I had heard about a friend who had biked across the country from my hometown in Medford, Mass to Medford, Oregon. And always want to challenge myself. I said, well, if he can bike across the country, I can run across the country. Well, that's an idiotic comparison, biking and running. But I just said, no, I'm going to do this. I'm going to earn the right, like my grandfather taught me. I'm going to train, and I'm going to train. And I did. And I trained really hard. And then I said, something, I don't know that I can just do this for me. It's too daunting of a challenge. 45, 50 miles every single day, the 80 consecutive days, through all kinds of conditions, through the desert, over the Rocky Mountains. Can I really do this? Then I thought, I better do this for a greater purpose. So I went to a place called the Jimmy Fund, which is the fundraising arm of the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, where little kids are being treated for cancer. And I decided to do it for the Jimmy Fund. And, I just knew at the time that the battle that these kids are fighting for their own life, mine was nothing compared to that. So that just inspired me to get out there and get this thing done. So I did. In 1978, ran from Medford, Oregon to Medford, Mass, 3,452 miles in 80 days. And my dream as a little boy was to play second base at Fenway Park in Boston, home of the Red Sox. Well, I finished that run that year in front of 32,000 people at Fenway Park. And even though I wasn't playing in Fenway like I dreamed I would do someday, I was running in Fenway. And I just felt like that was the moment in my life I became the athlete I always wanted to be.
Such an amazing story. Thank you for sharing that. I remember seeing some of those photos from you, you running. I haven't heard the story that you told about your grandfather, but I
Yeah.
guess you were kind of destined to be a part of Boston Marathon's history.
I guess I am now. I've run more Boston marathons than anyone in the world, other than maybe two or three other people. And I ran it for 15 years in a row, and then I got offered the job to direct it. And I was like, oh man, what do I do? Do I run in it or do I help run it? And I struggled for weeks with that decision to take the job or not. Then I said, how can I pass up the opportunity of directing the most prestigious marathon in the world? This is what I do for a living. Like, it doesn't get any better than this. So I took the job. And I directed it that morning, and I'm standing at the finish line later on in the afternoon, and I'm high-fiving all the runners. And, but I was full of something that I told everyone never to be full of, and that was self-pity. I was just full of self-pity that I hadn't run. Here they are, thousands and thousands of people crossing the finish line, and I didn't do it for the first time in 16 years. So I tapped a state trooper on the shoulder, and I said, officer, will you do me a favor? He goes, what? I said, will you drive me back to the start? He goes, why? Did you forget something? I said, yeah, forgot to run. He drives me back to the start, 8 o'clock at night. I took off. He escorted me the whole way. I finished a little bit after 11 o'clock at night after directing it all day. Finished last, of course, and I did it that way for the next 36 years. So directed the race during the day, go back out later in the afternoon, early evening, and bring up the rear. So I've got it both from the directing side and then from the participatory side. So no one else can say they've done that.
Oh, that is crazy. And I do feel like I was going to ask you, and I still want to ask you to present yourself. But before you do, I just want to thank you. And I'm sure I'm speaking for thousands and thousands of people for when I say thank you for, the experience that you've given us. For me, I've experienced a lot in my life, but that day in April, this spring I'm getting emotional talking about it, the best day of my life,
Yeah.
that energy and the way it's organized, everything, from picking up the bib at the expo, meeting your colleagues there, and to running it and finishing. It's such an amazing thing. And I know that you've, played a big part in making running or what it is today, especially in the US and with the Boston Marathon. But it definitely has helped and improved a lot of people's lives. So thanks for that, Dave.
Yeah, I mean, I tell people all the time, even though my title might have been race director, I'm more of just a caretaker. It was here before I was born, and it'll be here long after I'm gone. I'm just taking care of it for a while. And I always tell people my greatest skill set is surrounding myself with people who are smarter than me. You put a good team together, and they make you look good. And of course, it's always a team effort. It's something that daunting as a point-to-point marathon with 32,000 people in it. It takes an army to pull that thing off. And our greatest asset at the marathon is more the experience and the expertise of the folks who've been around for a long time, 10, 20, 30, 40 years doing this. And they've become the best in the business at managing their discipline or their area of the event. And it seems to come together very well on race day, for sure.
Yeah, it was a perfect, for me at least, it was a perfect day. Really appreciated everything from that week, like the beginning of that weekend until finishing on the Monday. It's just amazing.
Awesome.
But yeah. And for those those of you who are listening now to this podcast, obviously you probably know before we even started talking that we're talking to the race director of the Boston Marathon. But if you were to present yourself, you obviously did a little bit of that already. Who is Dave?
A friend. I don't consider myself any better or any more important than anyone else on the planet. Um, I am very hardworking, very disciplined, um, very organized, very anal when it comes to all that. Um, but I truly like to give back. I feel when you give, you receive even more in return. And it's like a trick. People say, I can't believe you gave of yourself or donated or whatever. And I said, hey, I got way more back than what I gave. Um, so, and I think we're all in this together. I believe in sharing. I believe in compassion, giving people a chance. That's all, like I said at the beginning, all I ever wanted in life is a chance. And so I try to do that. When people ask me, what do you do for a living? I say, well, I'm a race director. They're like, you're a what? I said, a race director. They said, what the heck's a race director? Like, what do you do? Chalk mark in the road, yell go, off they go. I said, well, that's part of the equation, yeah, but you want to really know what I do? They said, yeah. What I do is I help raise the level of self-esteem and self-confidence of tens of thousands of people around this world. What do you mean? You'll find out. And that's truly what this is all about. It's funny because a lot of times I'm asked, what's the toughest part about running a marathon? I said, oh, the toughest part? It's signing the application. Signing the application? I said, yeah, it's having the courage and the guts to make the commitment. Then you got to do the work. And again, like my grandfather said, you have to earn the right. You have to do the work. You have to train. Then you go to the starting line. You answer the gun. You run the course. You cross the finish line. You get a medal. And magic happens. You go home feeling good about yourself. And there's nothing more powerful in the world than to feel good about yourself, because it's the foundation by which we accomplish everything in our lives. And that's all I'm doing. I'm giving people a chance to feel good about themselves. A lot of times little kids say to me, what do you want to be when you grow up? I said, well, what makes you think I want to grow up? But what do I want to be? And I never was always sure how to answer that question. And then I saw a billboard on the highway one day, and it had one word on it. And the billboard said, accomplisher. And I said, that's it. That's what I want to be, an accomplisher. All I want to do is set goals, work hard, accomplish it, check it off, move on to the next one. And I often get asked, all the different things you've done, what do you think is your best accomplishment? And, my best accomplishment is my next one. It's my next one because what I've done in the past is over. I can't go back there. But it's the foundation of confidence to go forward. So I'm always living for today and planning for tomorrow. And, it's never going to, these things and these goals are never going to end, right? I'm just going to keep setting new ones and keep trying to accomplish.
And you have accomplished quite a lot. I was, before this call, I was looking at everything that you've done, and I obviously knew you as the race director of the Boston Marathon, but then I realized that you were is it true that you were the 30th, finisher of all time in an Ironman? So very early on when Ironmans were held, you were the 30th finisher or something like that?
Yeah, so the first year, 1978, there were like 12 finishes. And then the second year, there was like 15, but some of those who did it the first year did it the second year. And then the third year, there was 108 of us. And that's when I did my first one, 1980. And I finished 14th overall, but a few that beat me who had already done it the year before that. So when it was all said and done, as far as person crossing the finish line of an Ironman, doing the calculation somewhat, And there were no other Ironman races around in the world at the time. I was like the 30th person to have ever crossed the finish line of an Ironman. Now look at the sport; it's just exploded. And it was funny because last year I did it in October last year, and it was my 10th Kona Ironman, and I'm standing there, and there's 2,400 of us. This was all men doing it. And as I thought about it, I said, I bet there's not one person here who has done a triathlon before I did. In fact, 90% of the people who are standing here probably weren't even born when I did my first Ironman, back in 1980, kind of a thing. So it's kind of a cool feeling to know that, not that I was a pioneer necessarily, but, once I did Ironman in 1980, then I came back to New England, said, I like that. I want to bring that sport back to, New England and East Coast and all that. So I did. So I started putting on triathlons around here. I actually ended up directing 150 of them. I did the second Ironman distance triathlon in the world on Cape Cod in Massachusetts, called the Cape Cod Endurance. So I had all the best triathletes in the world, which was really in the United States at the time, come to my race to do it, an Ironman distance race. And then I ended up directing, World Cup races in the Caribbean, directed the World Champion, the second triathlon, ITU Triathlon World Championship. The first one was in Avignon, France in 1989. And then the second one was here in the US at Walt Disney World in Florida. So I created that and directed it in 1990. And I was representing some of the best triathletes in the world at the time, the Dave Scotts and Mike Pigs and Scott Molinas and Aaron Bakers and all of them. It was like unbelievable time for me doing the whole triathlon scene.
I'm just, almost speechless when I hear you talk about this. And I also know that, because you mentioned your own running across the States, you have more than 170 marathons under your belt, right? And I also know that did you run Boston blindfolded? I just read something about that, but what's the story about that one?
So my brother works for a place right near the marathon course in Newton called the Carroll Center for the Blind. And he called me up one day and he said, why don't you do something and raise money for the blind? And I said, well, what do you want me to do? He said, I don't know. You're the one raising all this money for charity. You figure it out. And I said, I don't know. He said, well, why don't you run the Boston Marathon and raise money? I said, no one's going to give me any money just to run a marathon. Back in those days, no one did, right? There was no fundraising component to it. And so I said, all right, well, first I got to figure out what this whole visually impaired running club and what it's like to be blind a little bit, to simulate it. So I hooked up with some visually impaired runners and, spoke to them. And I said, all right, this is what I want to do. I said, I want to run this year's Boston Marathon with 2 guides and run it blindfolded. But I don't want people to think it's a stunt. It's not a stunt. I'm bringing attention to the extraordinary accomplishments of you people who are visually impaired, but still running the race. So I did. And I got 2 guys together. I was in pretty good shape then. And at the time, my PR was like 2 hours, 29 minutes or something for the marathon. So I was in pretty good shape. I ended up running 3 hours, 14 for that marathon, but I could have run much faster. But the guys guiding me couldn't run any faster. So it just, all these things I do, there are learning lessons learned, right? And this one was the concept of dependence and independence. Like I was dependent on them to get me through the course. And I said to myself after that was over, I never want to be in a position where if I can help myself to be dependent on someone else, because I don't want to burden anyone to help me if I can take care of myself. And I want to put myself in a position to help other people. So the whole idea here is I learned about the fact that those of us who do run, those of us who do take care of ourselves, that is not a selfish thing. That, in fact, is unselfish. Like when I go out for a run now, well, years ago when I went out for a run, I felt guilty. I was leaving my kids behind, my wife, and, Dave's doing his thing. And now when I go out for a run, I say, I'm actually helping them. Because if I don't get sick and I stay strong and they don't have to push me around in a wheelchair or feed me, I'm doing them a favor, right? So take care of yourself. And, try to preach the concept to everyone on the planet that the most important person in the world is you. Because it has to be you. It has to be. And if you don't take care of yourself, that's not fair to anyone else. So people will say, well, I can't, or I don't want to focus on me, but that's actually being selfish, right? So in any event, that's sort of where the whole running blindfolded thing came from.
Thanks for sharing that. And I want to touch on what you were saying. I think that's so important, right? Like whether it's physical health or mental health, I feel like we're becoming better persons or better versions of ourselves by doing what we love, and especially running. At least for me, I've experienced that myself, and I know that my fiance, she's also grateful that I found running because she sees that I'm happier, and that makes us as a couple happier. Exactly. Life is better. So it's not just a selfish thing. I agree with you. But you did mention that your personal record at the time was 2:29. Is that your fastest marathon today?
Yeah. It's funny because it's all a function of what you're training for. The only thing I wanted back in those days was to at least try to qualify for the Olympic trials. And I knew that I wasn't like an elite runner, but I knew I was right on the cusp of just sneaking in, on the backside of the first tier. I was more second tier, maybe third tier at the time. And so I said, if I do the right work, maybe I can sneak in. And I was part of the Greater Boston Track Club at the time. And that's what, Bill Rogers and Alberto Salazar and all those guys were good dear friends of mine. And we all sort of trained together. And our Coach Bill Squires was his name. I said, Coach, I want to qualify for the trials in my next race in Eugene, Oregon. I said, what do you think it's going to take? And the guy was brilliant, right? He was like the coach from Chariots of Fire. He really knew his stuff. And he said, all right, he used to call me Long Run. Hey, Long Run. He called me Long Run because I ran across the country. Say Long Run. He said, if you can do 8 repeat miles on the track with a 1-lap cool down, and whatever you can do that at average pace, you can run a marathon at 30 seconds slower. So if you want to run a marathon at 5:30, you have to do 8 repeat miles at 5-minute pace. I said, okay, see what happens. So I did my 8 repeats at like 5:05, 5:06 or something. So then I'm thinking, all right, I can probably run around a 5:38. And if I'm lucky, maybe a little quicker. And I had to run faster to qualify for the trials. So I went to this race and started off and I hit the mile right at the time I wanted to, 5:38, but I just didn't feel real comfortable running that pace. And I knew right that moment, this wasn't going to be my day to run, sub 220, 221, 222 or something. And I ended up running right around a 230, but he was dead on with his, sort of advice that whatever I could run repeat miles at, 8 of them on the track, add 30 seconds to it, and that's what you're going to run a marathon in. I don't know how he figured that out, but it was true for me, anyways.
That's funny. I had Jeff Galloway on the other day, and he was also talking about it, the magic mile, and how he used that, the fastest mile he could run, and then he would calculate all the the distances or the times you could run the other distances on. So it's interesting to hear. And obviously, being a 2:29 marathoner, not a lot of people can say that they have ever done a marathon that fast. And I assume that you never did that in any super shoes or with the fueling that we have today. So it's also even more impressive. And
Yeah.
and having done, so many Boston marathons, and I'm sure different times, some of them faster than others. But I was asked the other day if I could share something about how to train for the Boston Marathon compared to other marathons. And I guess you're the best person in the world to kind of ask that question. What would you say?
Well, first of all, there's very few people, elites, say, come and run Boston for the first time and nail it. It's one of those courses you have to learn it before you can run it really fast. Bill Rogers never won it his first time, a second time, DNF'd. Look at Kipchoge came, and everyone was saying, he's just going to blow this away. So I get asked by someone, a couple of weeks before the race, he said, how do you think Kipchoge will do? I said, he never came here to train on the course. They said, yeah, but he's probably simulating it somewhere else. And I said, it's not the same. You got to come here to learn this course. The topography of this course is so different than any other marathon you're going to run anywhere. And I said, to learn it is to know it, is to strategically run it well. So he didn't come and he ended up finishing sixth or something, whatever. But I do think that if you're fortunate enough, like I am, to live around here where you can train on it, then obviously you're acclimating yourself to the ups and downs of the Boston Marathon course. And, we all say that the idea is to hold back at the beginning, be patient, don't go out, too fast, even though there's a significant downhill for the first 5 or 6 miles. You're just going to drop 200, 300 feet. And but people just, they go out with the crowd and they pay the price on the back end. So the best times in the races where people have won, 90%, I think if you did the analysis, you'll see it's negative splits, right? So people were smart in just being patient, holding back. And even though the back end is climbing, whereas the front end is descending, you can literally run the back end faster than you can run the front end. When the course record was set at 2:03:02, that was a negative split, right? So that's just the way it is on the Boston course. So to try to simulate, if you don't live around here, the best you can do is, simulate the elevation, incline and decline, and where it happens. It's not just how much, it's where in the race it happens. So the climb obviously comes at 17.5, and the descent is right off the bat. So the descent right off the bat means you're feeling great. So you're going to pound it and you're going to beat the heck out of your quads. So by the time you get to the climbing part, you're just like, your legs feel like steel pistons, right? And you're doing the survivor shuffle down Beacon Street for the last 3 or 4 miles, and it's ugly. And you don't want that. The idea is for you to be able to get to 20, 21, 22, and then you pass people, not have people pass you. Because when people pass you, they're gaining the energy you're losing, and vice versa. So the whole idea is to feel stronger in the end. And that's all about patience. So that's my recommendation, is patience. You know what shape you're in. People, it's funny because you might say to someone, so what do you think you're going to do at the marathon tomorrow? Oh, I don't know. Well, yes, you do. Everyone knows, unless you didn't do any training at all. Then you know too. You're going to do lousy. But you have a pretty good sense for the shape you're in. You've done your long runs. You know your pace. Obviously, it's all boils down to the unknowns like the weather. But for the most part, you should have a pretty good idea within 5-10 minutes how you're going to run. And so you have to pace yourself accordingly.
Yeah, I think that's a very good take on it, and that's something that I hopefully will do better next year. I was told to take it chill in the beginning. Don't try to go too fast. One thing that I was surprised by when I drove through the course beforehand was that in the beginning there are quite a lot of rolling hills. It's
Yeah.
obviously you say that it's that it goes that we have a lot of downhills, and there are, but also a lot of rolling hills, and not just downhill. And so for me at least, that was a very good learning experience, that
Yeah.
I'm gonna take it even slower, even though I was trying to think about that.
Yeah.
I still after 5 miles my legs were tired, right? Like
Yeah.
I never had that feeling that early in
Yeah.
a long run or a race, and so that was different. But then I also know that a lot of people talk about, strength training, and that you have to prepare for Boston a bit differently. Obviously, the things you talked about with simulating the course a little bit if you're not living in Boston. But what would you say in terms of strength training or other, exercises that you could do before Boston? Do you have any
Right.
tips?
Again, a lot of times it comes down to how much time you have. We're all busy. We can only invest so much into training. I mean, so I did Ironman last year, and you can't do that on a barroom bet, right? I mean, you can't fake it. You got to do the work. And so I was training between 2 and 7 hours a day for Ironman. Well, a marathon's not as time consuming as that, but all the peripheral things you probably need to do to supplement the actual out on the road running is important too, whether that's in the weight room, whether that's massage therapy, whether that's you know stretching exercises and all of that. But it all adds up to time, and we're all in a rush. We're all busy. So you kind of sometimes, okay, what's the most important thing? Well, I got to get my run in. Well, what about, doing some upper body work or doing some core work or working the quads and all that? Yeah, I'll get to it. And then you never get to it. Right. So it all depends on, again, your own personal situation, how much time you have. If you're doing everything alone, or if you're being coached, because if you're being coached, then the whole guilt complex comes in, because you got to go face your coach later on that night and tell them what you did or didn't do. So if you only have you to answer to, then you can, get away with it a little bit. But in the end, it's going to come back to haunt you. But the more of all of that you can do, all balanced out properly, then the better off you're going to be, obviously in the race, if you can invest that kind of time.
Yeah. I'm also curious about your take on something, because people have asked me after my experience with Boston last year how the hills were. And my thoughts after were that the hills were not as bad as I thought they would be, because like I said, I started a bit too hard in the beginning, but then from after the downhill sections and up until the hills started, I felt like I was trying to just save my energy and not go too hard. And so when I got to the hills, I was like, I'm going to go by effort here. And they didn't feel as bad as I feared. I'm obviously based in Norway, where we have hills everywhere, so I can't go for a run without having a long hill in my run. So I'm probably more used to it than a lot of people anyways. But what is your take on those hills, if you are able to, like you said, with a negative split, running it strategically smart? Do you think that the hills are really hard, or is it more based on where the runners find themselves when they hit the hills?
I think it's where they're located within the actual course. I don't think the hills in and of themselves are that severe. There's basically four of them. People talk about three, but there's really four. There's the climb over what's Route 128, but it's a gradual. It's not steep, but it's just at mile 16. It just goes for about maybe a little over a quarter of a mile, right? But you're surprised by it. You're not expecting it, and here you are already starting to climb, and you haven't reached the first right-hand turn on the course at the fire station. So that one can get you kind of depressed because you weren't expecting it. Then you finally reach the fire station, make that right, and you're hitting Brayburn Hill in And it's steep, but it's quick. You boom, boom, you're up, right? And then it flattens out. And then the next hill by the Johnny Kelly statue, same thing, bang, you're up, and then it flattens out. And then the final hill, obviously, Heartbreak Hill, and it's steep, but it's not that bad. And it's, again, a quarter of a mile or something. They're really not that bad. It's just like one comes after the other, comes after the other, comes after the other. And it's in that whole, like, where you're hitting the wall concept, between 17 and 22 miles. I mean, right in there is where the toughest part of the race typically is. And then these darn hills are right in your way. So, but that's what I'm saying about knowing the course and knowing what's ahead of you and not being surprised by it, and kind of pulling back a little bit right before you get to those hills so that you have some pretty good energy to get up. And then the beauty about it is you're able to recover, right? And then give it another go, and then you recover and give it another go. So, for me, they're not, I don't think they're that difficult. And I've had a lot of people come up to me at times and say, oh, where was Heartbreak Hill? Like they didn't even know that they had already, that they climbed it, that they I missed it or something, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a tricky one, but I also I think, and you did say it, that it can, if you solve it the right way, you can actually do pretty well. But I also think that it's something, again, what you said, that you have to run it once to learn it, and then maybe after, then you can race it or try to run really fast.
With so many people, after they do the first one, they're exhausted. They're in their mind, they're like, maybe I'll never run a marathon again. I'm so beat up. But then all of a sudden, the next day, I can hardly wait to come back again. I want to run this the right way next time. So they already learned that. It was a lesson learned, already in the first one. So I want to come back again. Yeah.
How is it to, as a race director, you know that this is such a big goal for so many runners. When I qualified for Boston last year, I don't think I've ever been as proud. It's just such almost like, or it is a big victory to just qualify and be good enough to even run that. And how is it to be the race director and feel that energy on race day?
Well, I mean, it's a catch-22, because on the one hand, like I said, when I took the job, like, it doesn't get any better than this to be directing, the most prestigious marathon in the world. On the other hand, one could say that must be a lot of pressure on you and the team. And my response to that always is, well, pressure is a privilege, right? As long as you're prepared. Because if you're not prepared, you're going to get eaten alive. It gets ugly if all of a sudden, and there's no room for error. Especially at the start of Boston, all the different divisions, the wheelchairs, the hand cycles, the paras, the pro men, the pro women, all that. And then wave 1, wave 2, wave 3, wave 4. I mean, that has to be precise, because if it's not, then it's going to mess up down course and at the finish line. So you really need to know your surroundings. You have to know what's going on all over the place, down course. We're point to point, so you got all that transportation stuff going on, and like, is there an accident on the highway? Buses can't get here. Did the last few buses leave late? Do we hold? Do we go? The weather, Mother Nature. We've had all kinds of infernos and nor'easters and just lightning and downpours and everything. And so it's, like, what do we do? And I remember when it was 2012, it was 89 degrees at the start and along the entire course. And I was like, man, if you don't shoot the gun, no one gets hurt. Like, do we really want to fire this gun? This is going to be carnage all over the course for 26 miles. So I get up on the starters platform and I just announced to everyone, I said, listen, this is a team effort. There's you and there's us. Right. And unfortunately, we cannot fit all of you in our medical tents. You all won't fit. So you have to take personal responsibility. And for the most part, if you get in trouble, it probably was because you were reckless. If you've got to back off, you're not going to run a PR today. Hydrate well, ratchet it back, be safe, walk if you have to, just get across the finish line safely. And, for the most part, most of them paid attention to that. But we ended up treating 2,500 runners in our medical tents. We transported 250 people to the hospital. I mean, it was a war zone. No one passed. We all survived. But, I went home that night and I said to myself, why are you doing this? Right? Like, oh my God, because I felt almost personal responsible for 30,000 people. Right. And that's hard sometimes, but even though you're not, but you take it that way. So there's a lot there. And that's why I kid everyone that says, I have a button in my office that says, my job secure. No one else wants it. Kind of a thing. So, but it's a labor of love. Like I said, I enjoy it so much because I know it's transforming lives and making people feel good about themselves. And so that, makes me feel good.
Yeah, and I want to ask you about the 2014 Boston Marathon, because obviously we know what happened in 2013, but in 2014, I assume that there was also a lot of pressure, and it ended up being a very nice day. What was it like to be the director of the Boston Marathon in 2014?
Well, right after the day after 213, I did have a lot of people say to me that they may never come back again. And they were associating like my job with danger. It's not family fun and friendly anymore. They were right. Bombs went off but then within a matter of a day or so, it just flipped. And then everyone was like, no, we're coming back, right? We're coming back and we're going to take back Boylston Street and take back the finish line. And we're taking back our race. And then we were faced with the conundrum of there's so many people who want in, all these people. There was such interest in the race that we were like, how do we accommodate it? Because we can only fit so many people, right? And then you add the layer of intense, enhanced security for 2014 that we couldn't even start planning for 214 until about 6 months out from the race because we didn't know what the security aspect of it would be. So we couldn't even answer the question, well, can we put a tent there or a truck over here until public safety decided how they were going to cover the event. So you had less lead time. You had more runners. Holy cow, right? It's like, how's this going to work? But it did. And we went from 27,000 back up to 36,000, added a whole nother wave. I would ride the lead motor scooter every year. And this year, as I was riding down course, not only did I see, tens of thousands of people, but for the first time, I saw so many of them just holding up signs, just saying, we will not be denied our running freedom and all that kind of stuff, really inspirational type stuff. And a couple of days before the race, I went to dinner with Meb Keflezgy and his brother, Howie, and we're walking back to the hotel. And I said, Meb, so fill me in. Like, how are you going to run this race on Monday? He goes, well, this is what I'm going to do, and this is what I'm going to do. I said, okay. So then the gun fires, and I take off in the scooter, and I'm leading the men's pack, and there's Meb right up in front. I goes, that son of a gun, he's doing exactly what he told me he was going to do a couple of nights ago. And, it just all played out exactly the way he had strategized in his head. And he went on to win the race. It was first time an American had won in 20 some odd years or whatever. He has the names of the victims of the bombing on his bib number. I mean, like, you couldn't have written a better script as to how that year played out, 2014, and we came back strong, and that's where the moniker Boston Strong came from.
Yeah, and I love that one. It feels like it means a lot to me too. You know, the Boston Strong, there's something about it, having family in the area, and whenever I hear that, I get a little emotional, and yeah, it's super nice. And then now with the Boston Marathon this year, I saw even more discussions about, you know, the qualifying standards. And I know that you're not BAA, but still, what is your take on it, if you're okay to answer that question? A lot of people are saying that they should change the way you qualify for Boston, or that people shouldn't, you know, if they ran it this year, then they shouldn't be allowed to run it next year, or something like that, to allow more people to run. What is your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's a no-win situation. We're a victim of our own success, you could say. You know, for us, you know, we don't have the bandwidth like London does, or Chicago or New York. You know, our race starts, the starting line is 39 feet wide. I mean, you know, that alone kind of gives you, you know, the understanding that only so many will fit. So, and we've always been about the pursuit of athletic excellence. And so it's always, you know, the best of the best. That's what it's about, or was anyways. It could change. And then, you know, philanthropy entered the space, you know, about 40 years ago. So we started allowing charity runners in. And there's a delicate balance between how many qualifiers and how many non-qualifiers. And it's 80-20. That figure's out there now. So 80% of the people who run in that race have qualified, and 20% maybe have not, but have earned the right to be there just as much by raising money or doing whatever. So in order to accommodate everyone that qualifies, then you have to squeeze the qualifying times, because more and more people are qualifying. There's only so much space. You can't take them all. So they're not going to make the cut anyways. And when we squeezed the qualifying time this past year by 5 minutes, people were upset. And I'm like, why are you upset? Because if we didn't do it, you wouldn't have made the offset cut anyways. So wouldn't it be better to know earlier that you didn't make the cut than wait all the way till September to find out, right? And we may have to do that again, or the BAA, because we turned away 12,000 qualifiers last year, and I think it was 8,800 this year. And I mean, I really would like to see the day come when we nail it so tight that everyone who qualifies gets in. I mean, that's the way it used to be. Obviously, back in the 70s, 80s, 90s, anyone who qualified could raise their hand saying with full confidence, I'm going to Boston. You can't do that anymore unless you beat your qualifying time by, 20 minutes or something. So if you're right on the cusp, you're like, okay, I qualified to apply. I didn't qualify to run. Now I apply and keep my fingers crossed. And no one knows what that offset's going to be, because no one knows how many people are going to apply, right? So I get calls all the time leading up to race registration. What do you think the cutoff's going to be? I said, how do I know? Although I did guess this year that it would be 4:30, and it was 4:34. I was only off 4 seconds, but I have a sense of, I think I know the race pretty well by now. can kind of, but it was it was a guess. I mean, I didn't know, but yeah, I mean, and people have good, there's no bad suggestions. If you run it this year, you can't run it next year or whatever. Give people a chance to run. I get it. I even threw out there years ago there should be a 2-day event. Qualifiers on one day and non-qualifiers on another. And, there's a million ideas out there, but, you have to understand that there are ramifications and, of any decisions you make. You're not going to make everyone happy. And, you got to remember, our race is on a Monday. Even though it's a holiday here, it's still a soft holiday. So people still need to get to work or come home from work or do things. And we're just shutting down, right in front of their house, landlocking them. And, everyone's like, well, it's only one day out of the year. Yeah, well, what if there was an emergency? So we have to be sensitive to all the constituencies involved, not just the runners, although the runners are certainly the most important in our mind.
Yeah, definitely. Dave, I know that you have another meeting in 2 minutes, so we're just going to finish this call. I just want to thank you again so much for everything that you've done for us as runners and everything that you are doing. And thank you again for guesting the Marathon Podcast.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
There were a lot of other things that I really wanted to discuss with Dave, like his books that he's written about his upcoming. It looks like a documentary that I'm curious about that I didn't actually get any answers to. I was curious about more of his own running story. I was curious about more of, the best experiences that he had as a Boston Marathon director. There were some things that I really wish that we could touch on, but I do feel like the most important things we were able to talk about. And I hope that if you are running Boston next year or hoping or planning to run Boston at any time in the future, that this episode helped you. I feel like there's no one better to talk about this than Dave. In addition to this, I am going to make an episode later on, maybe within the next week or two. I know that a lot of people start now preparing their training for Boston, not necessarily their training or marathon block, but just starting to build something to be ready for when that marathon block starts. So I'm going to try to make an episode on my experiences and what I'm going to do going forward, or what I think will be important going forward in terms of the Boston Marathon. Thank you so much for listening to the podcast. I really appreciate that. And just want to ask again if you can give this podcast a review or share it with a friend, follow it wherever you listen to the podcast. And thanks again to Dave for coming on. That was definitely a highlight of this podcast so far, to have the Boston Marathon race director on. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you in the next one. You listen to the Marathon Podcast, brought to you by Wall Studio.